Okay, there we go. All right. So, this is the last slide from yesterday, so you don't need to type anything out. All right. Like I said yesterday, you guys joined me on Google Meets. We're introducing chapter 7, and like I said, chapter 7 is the shortest chapter in this textbook, other than maybe chapter 1. All right. And the reason being was kind of one of the things that I sent out in the video on Monday to kind of introduce the chapter. And if you haven't got a chance to watch that and kind of answer the questions, I recommend that you still have time to do that. But the deal is that in a lot of cases, kind of African history has been manipulated. All right, like I said, when I was coming up in the game, in the education game in the late '80s, my teacher didn't even touch upon that. So he said we were mainly focused on European history. All right, but the kind of like there's a numerous factors on why that is, and a lot of that plays into colonization. Africa, unfortunately, one of the kind of attractive points of Africa was that it has a lot of resources. All right, and in the beginning of the 20th century, like the 1900s, there's only 2 nations in Africa that were not dominated by Europeans or colonized by Europeans. All right, one was Ethiopia, which we talked a little bit yesterday with the kind of the origins of the state of Axum. All right, and the other one was Liberia, which is a country in West Africa that in the 1830s was founded by former slaves from the United States. And so, other than that, we had the British, the French, even the Belgians got involved, the Portuguese, the Spanish. All right. Big on the British and the French, though, and this was usually tied in with industrialization. They were extracting natural resources like rubber and oil and coal and stuff like that for industrialization. All right, and so you have certain senses where there's a number of cultures, like I talked about, like the Nok, all right, which were basically in what is now Nigeria, that they believe may have kind of smelted and worked iron real close to what the kind of Hittites did. They were considered the first people to do so. But they didn't leave any written records behind. A lot of these kind of and again, Africa is not monolithic. There's hundreds of different kind of ethnic groups with their own kind of identities and kind of languages and customs and stuff like that. And so, but there's a number of them that would pass on these kind of histories through the use of like basically kind of like what we call like griots in West Africa. They're kind of storytellers, all right? And then you have others, like we talk about the kind of the Kushites, all right? Not that Kush, but a different Kush, who are tied in with their emulating kind of Egyptian kind of practices, right? Or the Swahili through their kind of basically their conversion to Islam and kind of solidify trade contacts with those coming from Arabia or India and such. That by the time the decline of the Swahili coast towns, Europeans were crediting Arabs for building those cities and stuff like that. And then you also have like in Zimbabwe, all right, which if you got to watch the video on Monday, at the beginning of the chapter, they were talking about how in like Southern Africa, there in the 1800s, there's a group of people that are today referred to as Afrikaners. It's spelled with a K. They are Dutch and like German and kind of like settlers that came there in the 1800s with English thrown in there. They have a very unique kind of dialect. Did anybody watch the video on Monday? I know it's probably The guy on there, he was like the guy goes, my grandfather called this the Mapogube, the hill of the jackal. Do you remember that dude? That was like. Yeah, he's like he's Afrikaner. All right. The story is that like Afrikaners claimed that they arrived on the African continent the same time that Black Africans arrived, which today we know that's absolutely insane. All right. But this was like so the deal is the Shona people in today modern day Zimbabwe could look at a structure called Great Zimbabwe as basically this is like we were here, this is our claim. But in the 1800s into 1980, Zimbabwe was known as Rhodesia, which basically was a country that was established by a guy named Cecil Rhodes that had a apartheid type of system there, where we have a white minority basically kind of ruling over a black majority, and that the black majority was kind of viewed as second-class citizens. Yeah.
I think they heard saying like the Caucasians.
Yeah, and there's all this kind of same thing with like kind of like with Cahokia. They don't credit the kind of indigenous population of building these things because that delegitimizes their claim. All right. So I'm going to show you this video that I meant to show you yesterday, but I kind of ran out of time, talking about who built Great Zimbabwe and the significance. And what I was going to talk there was the kind of like some of the comparisons to Cahokia to a certain extent.
Stretched across a tree-peppered expanse in southern Africa lies the magnificent ruins of Great Zimbabwe, a medieval stone city of astounding wealth and prestige. Located in the present-day country of Zimbabwe, it's the site of the largest known settlement ruins in sub-Saharan Africa, second on the continent only to the pyramids of Egypt. But the history of this city is shrouded in controversy, defined by decades of dispute about who built it and why. Its name comes from the Shona word Madzimbabwe, meaning big house of stone, for its unscalable stone walls that reach heights of nearly 10 meters and run for a length of about 250 meters. For its grandeur and historical significance, it was named a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1986. Back in the 14th and 15th centuries, it was a thriving city. Spread across nearly 8 square kilometers, Great Zimbabwe was defined by 3 main areas: the hill complex, where the king lived, the great enclosure, reserved for members of the royal family, and the valley complex, where regular citizens lived. Rulers were both powerful economic and religious leaders for the region. At its highest point, the city had a bustling urban population of 18,000 people and was one of the major African trade centers at the time. What enabled this growth was Great Zimbabwe's influential role in an intercontinental trade network. Connected to several key city-states along the East African Swahili coast, it was part of the larger Indian Ocean trade routes. The city generated its riches by controlling the sources and trade of the most prized items: gold, ivory, and copper. With this mercantile power, it was able to extend its sphere of influence across continents, fostering a strong Arab and Indian trader presence throughout its zenith. Archaeologists have since pieced together the details of this history through artifacts discovered on site. There were pottery shards and glassworks from Asia, as well as coins minted in the coastal trading city of Kilwa Kisiwani, over 1,500 miles away. They also found soapstone bird figures, which are thought to represent each of the city's rulers. And young calf bones, only unearthed near the royal residence, show how the diet of the elite differed from the general population. These clues have also led to theories about the city's decline. By the mid-15th century, the buildings at Great Zimbabwe were almost all that remained. Archaeological evidence points to overcrowding and sanitation issues as the cause, compounded by soil depletion triggered by overuse. Eventually, as crops withered and conditions in the city worsened, the population of Great Zimbabwe is thought to have dispersed and formed the nearby Mutapa and Torwa states. Centuries later, a new phase of Great Zimbabwe's influence began to play out in the political realm, as people debated who had built the famous city of stone. During the European colonization of Africa, racist colonial officials claimed the ruins couldn't be of African origin. So, without a detailed written record on hand, they instead relied on myths to explain the magnificence of Great Zimbabwe. Some claimed it proved the Bible story of the Queen of Sheba, who lived in a city of riches. Others argued it was built by the ancient Greeks. Then, in the early 20th century, after extensive excavation at the site, the archaeologist David Randall McIver presented clear evidence that Great Zimbabwe was built by indigenous peoples. Yet, at the time, the country's white minority colonial government sought to discredit this theory because it challenged the legitimacy of their rule. In fact, the government actively encouraged historians to produce accounts that disputed the city's African origins. Over time, however, an overwhelming body of evidence mounted, identifying Great Zimbabwe as an African city built by Africans. During the 1960s and 70s, Great Zimbabwe became an important symbol for the African nationalist movement that was spreading across the continent. Today, the ruins at Great Zimbabwe, alluded to on the Zimbabwean flag by a soapstone bird, still stand as a source of national pride and cultural value.
So this is the enclosure where it kind of gets its name. Like it says, they said big house of stone, great house of stone, I've heard other kind of adjectives. There's a little bit of similarity with this in kind of Cahokia because, like you said, like there's 3 parts. You have the hill complex right there, which is Mapungubwe. And so that's where the kind of the chieftain came. We don't know because it didn't leave behind like any written records. Same thing in Cahokia. You got monks found there, kind of serves that. And again, in Cahokia, they just leave behind written records. And then if you notice, like just like they have like parts of it, it's kind of the palisades, whatever, the kind of the fencing that would be around there. They believe that there was kind of entrenched there was kind of the kind of higher class of like the social on the social stratus that would live there. Same thing with this. This is believed to be kind of like where the royal family kind of resided. And then just outside of that, you would have the valley where the population was. Like at Cahokia, it was roughly about the same population, close to about 20,000. All right. And then when the Europeans arrived, again, like how when the French would arrive here, or like kind of the English would arrive here, they would basically state that this was not built by the indigenous people, this was built by somebody else, and they kind of make up these elaborate stories and stuff like that. So there's a little bit of that similarity in there. Today, like I said, there's a modern day country called Zimbabwe that takes its name from that ancient kingdom. And so in West Africa, which we'll talk about today, we see a lot of modern day countries today in West Africa that do the same thing. One of the first ones is the kind of what's considered the first great kingdom in West Africa, what they refer to as the Ghana Empire. All right. Now the thing about these empires in West Africa is that controlling trade routes, particularly the trans-Saharan gold and salt trade, was very important to their success. All right. And so obviously gold is, we can see, people like gold, right? They like flashy things if they want to kind of add to their drip, right? Salt, though, what's the big deal about salt? I got salt at home, man. I could salt my food all day, a day. What's the big deal in the ancient world about salt? Why would people would control the salt trade?
Keeps food good.
Yeah, preservation of food, exactly, right? And so you don't have really much refrigeration here. So, and millions of years ago, the Sahara, what we know as the Sahara Desert today, was an ocean, right? So there's a lot of salt deposits and mines there, right? And so one of the first kind of, and what they refer to as the Songhai, the people of Songhai, were the first ones to kind of control these trade routes that led all the way across kind of North Africa, right? They established what's considered the kind of first urban center, called Kumbasaya. Now today, this region is referred to as the Sahel. All right, Sahel is an Arabic term meaning coast. All right, and so it's not like a coast where we think of like next to an ocean, but it's the coast of between the very kind of edge of the Sahara Desert. All right, and so the name Ghana actually is the name given to basically the leader, the king. All right. The deal is, though, most of the histories do not come from the Songhai, but come from Arab and Berber traders based out of Morocco, all right, because they knew in North Africa that this was the area to get gold and salt and such. So according to some of these traders, these merchants, and they kind of documented this, they would engage with the Songhai something called the silent trade, all right? And the Songhai had reasons to be kind of weary of kind of direct contact with these Arab and Berber traders for them being Muslims, is that if you were not Muslim, that kind of opened up an opportunity to be sold into slavery, all right? And so the story was that the Songhai would basically do this trade where they would kind of, and it was undetermined why these certain places were picked. But they would go out in this open area and they would basically bring gold or salt or iron or whatever like that, and they would set it down, and then they would retreat into the distance and bang these drums. All right, the Arab and Berber traders knew that's that they basically they would come out and then they would offer cloth or spices or whatever they're trading. They would set it down and then they would retreat. And they would bang the drums. And then the Songhai merchants would come out, they would observe what was left there and be like, okay, that's fair. They would take the cloth or the spices and they would go off, all right? If they determined that they were kind of being ripped off, they would take a little gold away or take a little salt away or stuff like that. And that trade could last for hours, all right? But it was basically to protect them from being sold into slavery. And they had reason to kind of fear for that. Now later, some of the Songhai later are going to convert to Islam, much like how the Swahili convert to Islam to kind of solidify trade contacts, but they have reason to be concerned because by the 11th century, there was a kind of Muslim Arab Berber dynasty called the Almoravids, who basically were based on Morocco, that came down and basically wreaked havoc. And kind of as a result, the Songhai lost control of these kind of trade routes. All right, this is the area that we're talking about. All right, now the modern day country of Ghana is right here. There is no direct link between the modern day country of Ghana and the Songhai people of ancient Ghana. However, the thing that they used this name, though, was that in 1953, the modern-day country of Ghana right here was the first African nation to gain its independence from a European power. So what they did was they basically used history, and they harkened back to the first great kingdom in this region to give them their modern country the name. All right, so that's where that comes from. All right, now after the fall of the Ghana Empire, all right, within a couple hundred years, another kind of West African empire emerges called Mali. Not that Mali, but a different Mali. They're often sometimes referred to as the kingdom of the Sonke. Hello? Oh, you want me to send them down the office? Tennis office, sure thing. All right, thank you. Bye. Isaiah, it's your lucky day. You get to leave. Go to the attendance office. I'm sorry. You don't get to see this in person. I'll make a recording of it though, and you can watch it later and share with family and friends, which most of you guys do, right? Okay. Yeah, you know what I'm saying? Yeah. All right. So, like with Ghana, the Kingdom of Mali is often referred to as the Kingdom of Mandinka or Mandingo. All right, that's the kind of ethnic group there. There is a modern-day country called Mali today. There's a direct, though, relation between ancient Mali and this Mali, because in Mali, the modern-day country of Mali, they are the largest ethnic group of the Mandinka. And so this is, eventually they are going to expand upon the Empire of Ghana, and basically, and we see that kind of trajectory going. So this is the Mali Empire. All right, we see kind of incorporated Kumbasael. All right, modern-day Mali's right here. So much of the heart of the ancient Mali kingdom is in what is now modern-day Mali. All right. Now the founding of, we know, like for the Ghana kings, there was a dynasty called the Sise. All right. But the kind of founding of the Mali Empire is told in a epic called the Epic of Sundiata. This is a story that was passed down through oral traditions that was later finally written down. That every kind of school kid in West Africa is aware of it. It's similar in the sense, sometimes people make comparisons to the Lion King, because Sundiata, his name means lion, hungering lion of some sort. All right. So in the story, in the epic, Sundiata's father was a Mandinka chieftain, king, all right, who was informed by a diviner, a prophet, who came to him and says, listen, your next son that you have is going to be a great leader, the greatest leader of the Mandinka people. However, you have to father this child. You have to father this child with the ugliest woman of the Mandinka tribe, right? And he's like, well, who am I to judge prophecy? So the story was he went out, sent out ambassadors to find the ugliest woman, and then these guys brought this woman named Sologon, whose name means water buffalo woman, to him. She had a big hunch on her back, and and he looked at her and said, "That's the one." All right, and he marries her, and they have a child. That's Sundiata. All right. However, after Sundiata's father dies, him and his mother are basically exiled, all right, and they go to a kind of a neighboring kind of people called the Mesa, and the Mesa people are basically take him in, all right. In the meantime, Sundiata has a half brother, all right, who was particularly cruel to him as a child. Sundiata couldn't walk, all right, and he was made fun of. It wasn't until about 12 or 13 with the help of these iron crutches he was able to walk. He basically grew up to be a strong male, though. He was very kind of like a general within the Mesa kind of kingdom. The Mandinka people reached out to him to basically come back and save them. There were some people called the Sosa that had taken over, and his half-brother split. All right, and so what ends up happening is he returns. There's a battle that's listed in the histories. All right, however, in the epic, the battle is more focused on an individual battle between Sundiata and the king of the Sosa people, in which at one point they basically Sundiata acquires these bofons, which are these kind of musical instruments that were used in West Africa that are magical. They're like drums. And what ends up happening, like he would disappear. And so it's kind of similar. One of my kids used to watch, where is that show? It was like the anime show with, they would always be fighting in the air. Did you ever see, what's that? Yeah, something like that, or whatever, Naruto or whatever, those other ones, I don't know what they're called. But similar to that. And eventually he defeats him, all right? And in the meantime, he takes over the title Mansa, which means basically king in the Mandinka term. So he's the first Mansa. Sometimes they're referred to Mansa Sundiata. He established what they call the Kieta kind of dynasty, if you will. All right. So this story has some similarities with a lot of people, although Lion King is mainly Hamlet. People make some connections here with him in exile and stuff like that, and the name being Lion. All right. Now, the kind of most famous Mansa, though, is the 10th Mansa, who kind of ruled during the 14th century, and that's Mansa Musa. He was the great nephew of Sundiata. All right. Now, what Mansa Musa does is the peak of the golden age of the Mali Empire. Mansa Musa is essentially, basically, at some point, he has a complete monopoly on gold in West Africa. All right. He also is important for making a particular city the kind of cultural and commerce center of the Mali Empire, and that's the city of Timbuktu. Have you ever heard of Timbuktu? When somebody says Timbuktu, they mean a place that's way out in the boonies, all right, way that's a little far away. However, Timbuktu was a bustling center for trade and education, stuff like that. During the time of Mansa Musa, All right, and some people believe that during his time, Mansa Musa might have been the richest man in the world. All right, I'm gonna play this little short TED video that talks about that and his religion, which we'll talk about in the next slide.
If someone asked you who the richest people in history were, who would you name? Perhaps a billionaire banker or corporate mogul like Bill Gates or John D. Rockefeller. How about African King Musa Kita I? Ruling the Mali Empire in the 14th century CE, Mansa Musa, or the King of Kings, amassed a fortune that possibly made him one of the wealthiest people who ever lived. But his vast wealth was only one piece of his rich legacy. When Mansa Musa came to power in 1312, much of Europe was racked by famine and civil wars. But many African kingdoms and the Islamic world were flourishing, and Mansa Musa played a great role in bringing the fruits of this flourishing to his own realm. By strategically annexing the city of Timbuktu and re-establishing power over the city of Gal, he gained control over important trade routes between the Mediterranean and the West African coast, continuing a period of expansion which dramatically increased Mali's size. The territory of the Mali Empire was rich in natural resources, gold and salt. The world first witnessed the extent of Mansa Musa's wealth in 1324, when he took his pilgrimage to Mecca. Not one to travel on a budget, he brought a caravan stretching as far as the eye could see. Accounts of this journey are mostly based on an oral testimony and differing written records, so it's difficult to determine the exact details. But what most agree on is the extravagant scale of the excursion. Chroniclers describe an entourage of tens of thousands of soldiers, civilians, and slaves, 500 heralds bearing gold staffs and dressed in fine silks, and many camels and horses bearing an abundance of gold bars. Stopping in cities such as Cairo, Mansa Musa is said to have spent massive quantities of gold, giving to the poor, buying souvenirs, and even having mosques built along the way. In fact, his spending may have destabilized the regional economy, causing mass inflation. This journey reportedly took over a year, and by the time Mansa Musa returned, tales of his amazing wealth had spread to the ports of the Mediterranean. Mali and its king were elevated to near legendary status, cemented by their inclusion on the 1375 Catalan Atlas. One of the most important world maps of medieval Europe, it depicted the king holding a scepter and a gleaming gold nugget. Mansa Musa had literally put his empire and himself on the map. But material riches weren't the king's only concern. As a devout Muslim, he took a particular interest in Timbuktu, already a center of religion and learning prior to its annexation. Upon returning from his pilgrimage, he had the great Jinguereber Mosque built there with the help of an Andalusian architect. He also established a major university, further elevating the city's reputation and attracting scholars and students from all over the Islamic world. Under Mansa Musa, the empire became urbanized, with schools and mosques in hundreds of densely populated towns. The king's rich legacy persisted for generations, and to this day, there are mausoleums, libraries, and mosques that stand as a testament to this golden age of Mali's history.
So this is the image from the Catalan Atlas that was made in Spain. All right, and so Mansa Musa and Mali King of Kings synonymous with gold. That's supposed to be an image of him. Now this was made after he died, but there was about 10 more Mansas that kind of existed there. So it's him kind of holding a gold nugget. All right, and Mansa Musa was significant not just for essentially kind of like being wealthy, but also making Islam his empire's official religion. Very similar to what Enza does in the state of Axum. Is he basically kind of, and you got to keep in mind, this is multi-ethnic like empires tend to be. He's ruling over other cultures. One way is to basically kind of unify this empire through a kind of common religion. All right, and still to this day, Islam is the dominant religion in West Africa. All right, so he builds mosques in Timbuktu and other places like Janneh. He also has the construction of a university. It's the Sankor Madrasa in Timbuktu, which was used for purposes for kind of not just Islamic studies, but secular studies on math and science. People like Ibn Khaldun, who I talked about, the kind of the Muslim historian, he visited Timbuktu and visited the Sankor Madrasa. All right, and so people that were well aware of it, like into the Middle East, into Persia, were well aware of Timbuktu, right, and as well as in Europe. And so this is what they mentioned, the Jahor Mosque there, which is referred to as the mud and timber mosque, which its foundation is it's been rebuilt over time, but the foundation dates back to the 14th century. This is part of the Sankor Madrasa, right? At one point, there was a library there in Timbuktu at the Sankor Madrasa that had the most amount of books, more books than they had in all of Europe at the time. Probably the only other in Africa that was like kind of like coming close would be the Library of Alexandria at the time of the Ptolemies at that time. Unfortunately, in 2012, and there's a number of manuscripts were there dealing with astronomy, kind of mathematics, all this other stuff. But in 2012, there was a group called Al-Qaeda of the Maghreb. Maghreb is another term for North Africa that took over Timbuktu. And they destroyed a lot of these manuscripts that weren't related to religion. Luckily, somebody was able to kind of sneak them out. They did things like there was a Sufi saint, there was a Sufi kind of shrine there that they basically destroyed and dug up the Sufi saints' like remains and stuff like that. Eventually, they were driven out of Timbuktu and other cities in Mali with the help of the French military, because Mali was a French colony at one point. All right. And then, unfortunately, as empires do, after, like I said, there's like 10 more Mansas after Mansa Musa. And Mansa Musa like kind of showed his like kind of reverence towards Islam by making that Hajj journey. They mentioned in 1324, 1325. He gave away so much gold that it devalued gold in Cairo. It took about 10 years for that to come back up to pre-Mansa Musa term. And so after the kind of decline and eventual end of the Mali Empire, by the end of the 15th century, a new African kind of empire emerged in West Africa called the Songhai, who had served, they were a state within the Mali Empire. Right, and then by the end of that century, by the beginning of the 1500s, they were controlling the gold and salt trade. They just kind of replaced Mali in that sense. All right, similar to Mali, they were Muslims primarily. All right, this is the empire again expanding, a little bit more focused on the Niger River. All right, matter of fact, the Songhai actually had the first navy in West Africa, mainly to kind of control the Niger River. The founder, the guy who's considered the first king of the Songhai Empire, is a guy named Sunni Ali Buro. They just refer to him as Sunni Ali. Again, you see in that name is kind of reverence towards Islam. He's often referred to as Sunni the Conqueror, for not only just kind of like defeating the kind of Mandinka, but like kind of you had kind of like the Almoravids again, kind of in that area. And so he is going to move the kind of importance of Timbuktu away as a kind of an economic center, if you will, all right, and move it a little bit closer to kind of where the indigenous territory of the Songhai was, to a city called Gao, all right, in kind of the northern part of Mali today. Gao was the kind of de facto capital. It served mainly as the kind of the economic center, replacing Timbuktu. While Timbuktu still remained there there was a university still there, Sunni Ali did not give the patronage that the Mansas of the Mali Empire did. Unfortunately, the people who are writing the histories are the ones in Timbuktu. So Sunni Ali doesn't have necessarily a great history, considering that the fact that the people writing about him are not getting the benefit of their patronage. All right, and so he has a son named Sunni Bur, who only rules for about 6 months. All right, and then he is replaced by a Songhai general by the name of Muhammad Turi. All right, the story was that Sunni Ali's son, who succeeded him, wasn't a true Muslim, that he was still adhering to what we'll refer to as some forms of animism, kind of traditional African kind of religions, if you will. Sunni Ali's widow basically felt that this guy was illegitimate, and she referred to him as a skia, which was a derogatory term meaning like basically the unjust ruler, somebody who's a usurper. So Muhammad Turi took a derogatory term and turned it on its head. So he referred to himself as a Skia Muhammad, all right? And he establishes what they refer to as the Skia dynasty, all right? He then learns that the history, people who are writing histories are the one in Timbuktu, so he establishes Timbuktu as the cultural center. Gao was still the capital and still a major kind of like commerce, but he made sure that the scholars in the university were basically compensated. So his histories are pretty good. all right, because he understands the people that are writing the histories are the ones that are in Timbuktu, all right, and so he establishes what they refer to as the Askia dynasty, all right. Askia becomes synonymous with king, like Mansa or Ghana, if you will, all right. This is his tomb in the city of Ghana, which is the United Nations World Heritage Site, and then the last fully independent Songhai ruler at the kind of the tail end of the 16th century is Askia Dao. After he dies, the Almoravid dynasty again kind of comes down and wreaks havoc on the area, right? And the Songhai lose control of essentially all the major trade routes that are connecting the trans-Saharan gold and salt trade, right? And so after this, we also see there's a kind of an influx of a new kind of merchants or whatever, new kind of aspect of African trade, and that's Europeans. Europeans are starting, particularly the Portuguese and Spanish, are starting to kind of come a little bit around what they call the Gold Coast more. All right, they're not necessarily looking particularly for gold or salt. They have a more specific kind of commodity that they're looking for, and this starts with the Kingdom of Benin. All right, which compared to the other kind of empires, it's very small. All right, like Ghana, there's a modern day country called Benin, but it doesn't have a direct connection with ancient Benin. All right. This is also referred to as the kingdom of the Edo, and there's still people in the Ethiopia referred to as Edo language in that. We know in the Edo language what they referred to their kings as Oba. That was a title. All right. Sometimes they drop the S. The one Oba that I want you to know is, I think it's the sixth Oba by the name of Ozulao. Ozulao is the Oba that directly opens direct trade with the Portuguese, with the Europeans. All right. Now, like I said, the Portuguese are not looking for necessarily gold or salt, right? This coincides with the Portuguese making claims, let's say, in the New World, like Brazil, and later the Spanish in the Caribbean, right? They are looking for cheap labor because the native populations in those places, because of the diseases brought by Europeans, die off, all right? What's the cheapest labor in world history? Slave labor, okay? This opens the slave trade, all right, to the Europeans. All right, the Portuguese and the Spanish are basically just basically inserting themselves into already existing trade patterns. It got so they were coming around so much that the Kingdom of Benin actually established what they called factories. They didn't produce anything; they were holding pens. All right, so they would take from conquered peoples, they would take slaves and put them in a holding pen for Portugal or for Spain. All right, and so this area is referred to as the Gold Coast. Is also referred to as the Slave Coast. All right. Eventually, a later Oba is going to close off trade with Europeans by basically saying that no male slaves between the ages 17 and 25 can be sold to Europeans. All right. That essentially was supposed to kill off the slave trade, but Pandora's box was open. Europeans went to other places along the Gold Coast as well. All right. So that's the kind of unfortunate kind of history associated with Benin. But also in Benin, they also have these elaborate bronze kind of sculptures. Which, for example, this is the image of Oba in this bronze sculpture. In numerous, in the British Museum, there's a whole big room full of these that the British stole, if you will. But they're incredibly elaborate. This is another Oba, which shows the kind of him being fanned on a horse there. All right, and so these are, again, this is a culture that is extensive in kind of metalwork and stuff. All right, so tomorrow I'm just going to have an assignment that's going to cover 3 of the civilizations we talked about. I'm going to show a video from 60 Minutes on Lalibela, which I mentioned. And then on Friday, we'll finish up the chapter talking about certain aspects of society and culture and stuff like that. All right. Does anybody need me to move too fast and stuff? Does anybody need me to go back? I take it your silence means no.